morning and also good afternoon and good evening wherever you are. I would like to thank our audience joining us from various parts of the world. I looked at our RSVP list and it's really exciting to see students in Europe and Asia attending our events to learn about Korea. Welcome to the fourth Chosŏn Book Talk series. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Ksenia Chizova. She'll be talking about her book today, which is entitled Kinship Novels of Early Modern Korea Between Genealogical Time and the Domestic Everyday. She is an assistant professor of Korean literature and cultural studies at Princeton University. And this first book, which she published last year, is situated at the intersection of the history of emotions, family, and scriptural practices in Korea from the late 18th to the 20th century. And now she's currently working on her second book project, which traces the shifts in context and infrastructure of graphic media that shape the visual aesthetics of the Korean script from the 17th century calligraphic practice to the contemporary fonts and graphic design in the two Koreas. All right, so it is a great pleasure to have Professor Chizova with us today. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to her. Ksenia, it's all yours now.
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank Professor Jisoo Kim not only for this very kind invitation to speak about my work, but also for even beginning this wonderful lecture series that is devoted to Chosån Korea. It is really an honor to speak about my work alongside the esteemed colleagues who took part in this lecture series and will be taking part. I'm also very, very grateful to Jin Hwang for all of her efforts of coordinating the logistics for this event. So let me first share my screen and then begin with my presentation. So today I will be speaking about my book, Kinship Novels of Early Modern Korea, Between Genealogical Time and the Domestic Everyday. And I must begin by saying that the book's title does not designate a discrete literary genre. Instead, I'm trying to locate an extensive narrative momentum that swept across the literary field just when the patrilineal kinship took shape in the late 17th century. While genealogies documented normative patrilineal descent to secure status claims, funerary writings, family tales, and lineage novels encompassed the affective dimension of kinship life and those members of the domestic communities who were left outside the purview of the genealogy. In this talk, I will focus on the lineage novels. These are lengthy, multi-generational fictional texts that trace the affective contradiction of the Korean kinship. I will begin with reading a passage from the beginning of the book, and then I will consider lineage novel within two frames, its relationship to the Korean kinship structure, and also its place in the global rise of fictional prose. And I will end with a postscript commenting on the place of the lineage novel in the early 20th century. Vernacular Korean lineage novels begin in exactly the same way. These texts, which elaborate the intricacies of the kinship system of late Chosån Korea, open with the unveiling of the genealogical subject, an emotional self socialized within the structures of prescriptive kinship. Unfolding the genealogical context of the lineages they center on, these novels connect the familial and the political, the hereditary moral excellence of the lineage members, and the security of the dynastic royal house, which they serve. The status attributes, proximity to the affairs of the court, and absolute dedication to moral virtue are pinned to the figure of a notable ancestor. And just to get a sense of how lineage novels begin, I would like us to turn to a novel called Wanwalhwaemyeon, The Pledge at the Banquet of Moon-Gazing Pavilion, which is to date the longest novel in the Korean traditional canon. And so the novel begins. During the reign of Yeongjong of the Great Ming, the imperial grand mentor, the grand secretary, Lord Jinguk, Jonghan's courtesy name was Kyewon, and his nom de plume was Munchong. He was the descendant of Songhyun Master Myeongdo. This glorious lineage stretches to the Yuan dynasty, when the lineage descendants distinguished themselves from the ordinary folk. They loved learning and read books, possessed benevolence, wisdom, filiality, and brotherly love. Their virtues and sagely conduct were never marred by the ways of the world. With no desire for worldly fame, they were inconspicuous as dust that covers all four directions. After Tejo of Ming unified the realm and all under heaven came together, they did not leave their dwellings in deep mountains and remote abodes, thinking wealth to be no more than grass and dust. But when it came to the sagacious reign of Emperor Moon, in his quest for virtuous officials immediately after enthronement, he recruited Lord Munchong into his service and treated him with utmost decorum so that no one dared turn against him. Lord Munchong's loyalty to his sovereign and ability and virtue in all manners of conduct were unparalleled in the world. Like many other novels from Chosån Korea, this text too is set in China, but it unmistakably elaborates the details of Korean kinship life. We see here the genealogical opening. We encounter illustrious lineage endowed with elevated position and virtue. In the lineage novels, this genealogical beginning is usually matched with genealogical closure. So the happy ending for these texts that are all about violent emotions are actually accounts of generations that spring forth after the events of the novels are concluded. And this genealogical opening and genealogical closure paint the lineage as a timeless, enduring enterprise and establish the stability and value of kinship norms as a background for the narrative of violent emotions. The patriarch here, Jong-han, appears in his full glory, but of course he is not central to the narrative. His figure kind of hovers above the events the novels describe. The patriarch usually presides at family banquets, dispenses wise words of warning, and sometimes orders a flogging for his especially unruly children. The novels themselves, however, are occupied with coming-of-age stories of younger protagonists who navigate the kinship system. They first contest and then settle into the kinship law. The rise of the lineage novel is Coeval, with the fleshing out of Korean patrilineal kinship in the late 17th century. Patrilineality designates social practice where the first son born to the primary wife inherits property and ritual role. And this form of kinship was a serious realignment compared to the kinship configuration of the earlier Goryeo dynasty. The Joseon dynasty, established in the late 14th century, defined its legitimacy on moral terms as sage kingship that attempted to bring correct moral order to human society. The view of moral human life was drawn from the Confucian framework that naturalizes the family as a site where ethical human bonds are established and then extended from there to the entire society. Filial piety or reverence to one's elders constitutes the essential virtue, which is expressed, among other ways, in the ancestral worship ritual. Korean lineage, therefore, clarified the patriline and thereby supplied the correct line of descendants who could officiate at the ancestral sacrifices. For Korean elites, this moral and philosophical framework provided practical means for securing their social status. By fashioning themselves to be the most upright moralists, the elites were able to buttress their privilege, converting cultural capital into social and economic capital. Kinship determined all areas of life in the society of Chosån Korea, one's access to economic resources, marriage network, education, and career. So to understand Chosån Korea, we need to know its kinship. And Korean kinship, as I argue, is unintelligible without the lineage novel. The lineage novel, that lays out affective compromises that patrilineal realignment involved. These affective compromises were felt especially acutely by elite women who relocated from their natal families to their husbands' households, negotiating the conflicting allegiance between these two sides of the kinship structure. Now, what are lineage novels? So lineage novels are mostly undated texts with very few scant external references, but they have circulated in Korea from the late 17th to the early 20th century. These are vernacular Korean sagas that are focused on domestic life. And it's significant that these texts are written in vernacular Korean. I argue that the lineage novel really marks the emergence of elite vernacular Korean culture that coexisted with the literary Chinese realm that was patronized by the elite men. Lineage novels are very long and intertextually rich texts with complex diction. On the left, you can see a manuscript of the lineage novel that is entirely transcribed in the vernacular Korean script. This belies the abundance of Semitic loan words that are simply transliterated into Korean. So to read a lineage novel, one would definitely need to possess sufficient leisure time and also education that would allow to read these transliterated phrases and connect them to appropriate literary context. There are also lots of literary allusions in this text that also connect to the broader literary realm. We don't know a single author of a lineage novel, but we know that these texts were read by elite women. Now here I don't mean to essentialize lineage novels as an exclusively female tradition. Of course, men also read these texts. They also participated in manuscript making, but reading vernacular novels never added prestige to the elite men of letters, and therefore they chose not to write about it. So in terms of cultural significance and social prestige, lineage novels were definitely linked to female readership. For a woman to read a lineage novel and to transcribe it was a prestigious task that was actually even a moment of pride for these women's families. And in the lineage novels, as I suggest, unruly feelings are the center stage, and they signify the most problematic structures, the junctures of the kinship system. I will turn in a moment to the lineage novels texts, but before that, I wanted to remark on the manuscripts, which are significant in their own right. Lineage novels are known to exist in the palace editions and in the private editions made in the elite families. Palace volumes like this one, this is a volume of Okwon Jung-hayeon, The Remarkable Encounter of Jade Mandarin Ducks. Palace volumes are transcribed on thick white paper, leaving significant margin space on the leaf. And they are written in impeccable calligraphy, believed to have been written out by palace women, who are also credited with the creation of this style of brushwork, which later spread outside the palace to become a necessary ingredient in elite women's education. Palace volumes are impeccable, but unfortunately, these are silent manuscripts. They tell us nothing about who made them and the circumstances in which they circulated. The situation, however, is different when we look at privately made manuscripts. This is a manuscript of the same novel, which was created in the family of Madame Zhong of Unyang at the end of the 18th century. The manuscript is mostly written in Madame Zhong's hand, although several other people also participated in its making. It's evident through the margin notes and also through the change of handwriting throughout the volumes. So this shows at a glance that manuscript making was a communal, familial enterprise. This manuscript actually has a lot of margin notes, and the margin notes are written by nieces, daughters-in-law, and granddaughters who praise Madame Zhong's skill and dedication and urge that the precious volumes be carefully transmitted to posterity. The manuscripts of this novel coordinate the encounter as a static and affective connection between generations of Madame Zhong's kinswomen. In excess of sentimental value, cultivation of vernacular Korean brushwork for elite women was semantically linked to the broader repertoire of bodily discipline, such as needlework, cooking, and filial bodily service that women were expected to cultivate within their domestic life. Lineage novels, therefore, have a non-textual layer of significance. They were learning primers through which women learned how to read and also how to write in a good hand. But of course, there are exceptions. So lineage novels manuscripts are mostly done in very good brushwork, except this one. This is also the third manuscript of the same lineage novel, Okwon Jehap. Here it says the title is Okwon Jehap Jung-hayeon, so titles can vary a little bit. But this manuscript kind of stands apart from the material accoutrements of the lineage novel tradition. The margin notes suggest that it was made by an elderly woman residing in the countryside sometime in the 19th century. The letters are wobbly, and the scribe frequently complains about the pain she feels in her hands and back. She also regrets being unable to wholeheartedly occupy herself with the copying task because her son actually passes the civil service examination and she is excited and agitated by the news. The scribe also remarks on the abysmal quality of the original manuscript from which she copies. She says the text is barely legible, the manuscript is in awful quality, and it actually seems that the family that possesses it doesn't care about it so much. Still, the scribe perseveres in her task as she's afraid that she needs to return the books and she's not sure when she can borrow them again. So in short, there is indeed some variety among the manuscripts, but we could still say that the majority of them are indeed tested. The majority of these manuscripts indeed attest to the significance of vernacular Korean calligraphy cultivated by elite women. So the lack of external references or precise dating allows us to reconstruct the lineage novel's history only in broad brushstrokes. The earlier boundary of the genre's history is marked by the margin note created by Kwon-sop, who records a list of books handwritten by his mother that were distributed to family members upon her death. While some titles he mentions remain unknown, several of them are now known lineage novels. Given the lifespan of Lady E, it is reasonable to imagine that she transcribed these books before the years of her physical decline. And given that several titles were available for her to copy, we might assume that lineage novels began circulating before the end of the 17th century, right? She dies in 1712. So in the 18th century, lineage novels are basically in their prime. And this genre declines in the middle of the 19th century when cultural, economic, and social developments decenter elite lineages from their social prominence. Lineage novels begin circulating in rental libraries, and they show limited interaction with the newly commercialized literary marketplace. Some novels, which cannot be classified as lineage novels proper, borrow the generic conventions of the lineage novel. The titles or narrative structure that spans several generations. So lineage novels have very distinct titles. They either reference households or generations or marriages or some kind of familial virtue. And these titles can be found in other types of fiction that cannot really be seen as lineage novels. In the early 20th century, lineage novels completely fade from cultural memory and from the first articulations of the national literary canon. Curiously, when some nationalist intellectuals and scholars, such as Choi Nam-son and Lee Byung-gi, set out on a quest of uncovering authentic vernacular, meaning non-literary Chinese, cultural beginnings, which would ground the sense of authentic Koreanness at the time when Korea was colonized by Japan between 1910 and 1945. So these intellectuals, these collectors, encounter lineage novels but are completely unsure where to place these texts. In 1966, lineage novels become an object of the so-called Great Discovery, which receives wide media attention, when several boxes containing these texts are found on the grounds of the Changdeok Palace by the research team led by Professor Jung Pyong-wook of Seoul National University. Even then, some doubt persists as to the origin of these texts, which are originally treated by some scholars as translations of Chinese novels. So it is only in the 1990s, with the rise of cultural studies and feminist literary studies in South Korea, that lineage novels receive academic attention. And the preliminary highlights of why is it important, why is it interesting to read these texts are the following. First of all, the historical dimension of Chosån kinship captured in lineage novels draws attention to the misalignment between blood-based filiation and the moral vision of human bonds that conceives them as transposable. Two fundamental but problematic relationships between father-in-law and son-in-law, as well as between stepmother and stepson, are uniquely elaborated in the lineage novel and rarely mentioned elsewhere in Joseon dynasty sources. And I will discuss the relationship between father and son-in-law shortly in greater detail. Secondly, lineage novel allows us a glimpse of the domestic culture of the time. Lineage novels texts feature encyclopedic accounts of domestic life cycles and relationships, as well as vivid presentations of bedroom scenes, children at play, domestic gatherings, and intimate conversations. Of course, these accounts are not fictional, are not factual; they're fictional, but they're imaginative renderings of domestic life. And the massive span of lineage novels allows these texts to delve into the minutest gestures of domestic intimacy. And third, the lineage novel captures the aestheticization of vernacular Korean writing and the emergence of early modern vernacular Korean fictional prose fueled by the narrative desire of kinship. After the promulgation of vernacular Korean script in the mid-15th century, its use remained mostly functional until the late 17th century, when elite women appropriated vernacular Korean culture as the domain of their learning and creativity. The lineage novel marks the emergence of elite vernacular Korean tradition, which predates the popularization of vernacular Korean fictional prose among broader audiences in the 18th century. Before turning to the lineage novels themselves, I want to approach these texts through the eyes of a person who lived in the 19th century and actually read a lot of lineage novels. Hong Hee-bok, who lived in the first half of the 19th century, was not an elite man, although he was very educated and very well read. He even traveled to Beijing as part of the envoy legation. And Hong Hee-bok decides to translate Li Ruzhan's novel Flowers in the Mirror into the Korean vernacular. And he appends his translation with the preface where he situates his translation within the contemporary literary field that he is familiar with. It is interesting that Hong Hee-bok, in fact, does not distinguish lineage novels from other types of fictional prose that are circulating at the time. So when he says vernacular novels, it means both lineage novels and other texts. How do we know that he actually refers to lineage novels? Because he actually records a lot of the titles of these texts. And here is what Hong Hee-bok writes. Vernacular novels are the amusement for women and the ignorant. The simple stories of their protagonists end with lifetime prosperity that follows the marriages made in the middle. Between these events, the plots depict stories of losing children and then finding them again and marrying them off, social advancements of treacherous subjects, households in disorder wrought by jealous wives and concubines, with subsequent reconciliation. It is not that vernacular Korean novels do not depict virtuous maidens and faithful wives. Their moral virtue and beautiful conduct are indeed powerful enough to move and educate the reader. Apart from this, however, vernacular Korean novels depict vile schemes and strife of treacherous subjects, jealous wives, and lustful women. They heap false accusations upon others and concoct disastrous conflicts, and their artifice and ill will, told in words never seen before, are astounding. Truly, even if such behavior actually occurred in real life, one would have to turn a deaf ear and a blind eye to it. Instead, all the fantastic details of married couples' struggles, intimate exchanges at the boudoir, or illicit thoughts of men and women are laid out in great detail, even praised, and overall relayed with such vivid realness. How could all this be appropriate to women's eyes? These stories can be beneficial if the reader appreciates and emulates the wise conduct of the good. However, if one perversely identifies with artful malignance, nothing can be more dangerous than that. So Hong Hee-bok adopts a very moralistic reading strategy for the lineage novels, saying that all of these violent emotions that are depicted in these texts are just harmful for the eyes of the readers, the majority of whom are actually women. But here I would like to disagree with his rather pessimistic approach to the discourse of feelings that unfolds in the lineage novels. What's interesting about this text is that they actually don't have clear-cut villains or heroes. Instead, Unruly feelings are actually seen as integral to the process of a person's socialization through prescriptive structures of patrilineal kinship. And these feelings are also integral to the narratives of private lives. So let us turn to the lineage novels now. In my book, I discuss kind of three most charged, most problematic junctures of kinship. That's the relationship between matrifilial and patrilineal kin, the role of desire in marriage, which is the central institution for lineage perpetuity, and also the problem with heir adoption when childless couples would adopt a boy who is actually not related to them by blood and that causes all kinds of other problems. Today, I will focus only on the first one, the relationship between matrifilial and patrilineal kin. The patrilineal kinship was premised on women's transition from natal to in-law family, right? Upon marriage, women actually physically relocated to their husbands' households, and their identity also changed in that they owed their filial allegiance to their parents-in-law. This transition was pivoted on women's obedience, that she was supposed to transfer from her father to her husband. What is curious, lineage novels and no other texts, so far as I know, problematize the relationship between the father-in-law and the son-in-law. And as the relationship between these two most important men in a woman's life worsens, she herself becomes a frigid mother to the couple's hard-begotten son and future lineage heir. So here I want to read this rather extended passage that depicts a very curious encounter between a father-in-law and his future son-in-law. So what happens here is So Se-gyong, who belongs to a family who is facing political persecution, for his own safety, in order to hide, dons a woman's dress and enters service in the mansion of Iwon-hee. Iwon-hee's daughter and So Se-gyong, who hides there, are actually promised in marriage when they were little children because the two families share ties of patronage and friendship. But the first encounter between the father-in-law and the future son-in-law is actually happening in a very strange way. We will open with Se-gyong's phrase, "My lord, why is it that you are here in the middle of the night?" How could Iwon-hee, the future father-in-law, know that these were words of resentment? Laughing giddily, he closes and locks the door, saying, "My heart moved the moment I saw you, but my wife is old and her jealousy is immense. There was nothing I could do, and I decided to place you at the service of my daughter. I can no longer wait, though. Do not worry about your lowly station. Because of my love for you, my wife will be unable to harm you. Do not think much about my age either. Even young boys could envy my energy and strength." Although discomfited, Se-gyong, right, the son-in-law, could not hold back a smile. He replied with a laugh, "Having achieved a ministerial rank and wide renown, how is it that you could not acquire someone to attend to you? Now you have to steal your daughter's maid. Being just 10 years of age, I am quite confused. Why do you speak these indecent words to me?" Iwon-hee looked closely at Se-gyong's delicate appearance in candlelight and found himself bedazzled. How could he possibly accept those words? With an absent-minded laugh, he approached Se-gyong and took his hands, intending to coerce him to play. Frightened, Se-gyong tried to put an end to this, but Iwon-hee was giving all his strength to the effort. When Se-gyong turned his body the wrong way, his natural form, Ponhyong, broke out. When Iwon-hee realized what happened, losing the color of his face, his eyes askew, and his head afloat, he was as if split with confusion. Right, so here we see a father-in-law at night making advances to his son-in-law, future son-in-law. I hesitate to read this amorous encounter as having connotations of homosexual attraction, because actually it's never intimated that Iwon-hee knows that Se-gyong is a boy, and as soon as his true shape breaks out, it causes confusion, and Se-gyong actually runs away from the house and nothing happens. Instead, I choose to read this sexual encounter as a potentially threatening, emasculating advance from the father-in-law to the son-in-law, because actually sexuality in the lineage novel is coded with power. Active sexuality signifies patriarchal authority, and men actually rape their wives into marriage. So here we have this very curious encounter between these two people. Later on, So Se-gyong, in the end, after running away from his household, he does in the end marry Iwoni's daughter, Lee Hyun-young. And the two of them then have a son, So Pong-hee. And what is curious is that this relationship, this strain between So Se-gyong and Iwoni, Lee Hyun-young's husband and father, produces this conflict in her, where she keeps telling her husband to actually reconcile with her father. So she refuses to obey her husband and insists that he needs to come to terms with his father-in-law. And almost in a gesture of revenge or persuasion, I don't know, Lee Hyun-young herself becomes a frigid mother to the couple's boy. And I'm going to read this other curious passage that illustrates what happens among these three people, mother, father, and son. Bear with me because I think this is a kind of a rather interesting rendition of the scene of domestic life. Just 5 months after birth, Pong-hee appeared mature and perceptive, already walking and trying to learn the sounds of language. He could recognize his parents, and looking at his father, he could cross his hands and imitate the posture assumed at reading. Sometimes he would even take the brush and pretend to be washing it. At moments, Pong-hee would let go of the breast and look back at his father, clapping happily and then embracing his mother again. Then he would go down to the bookcase and take a book, giving it to his father and lowering and nodding his head, imitating the sounds of reading and urging his father to read. To Hyun-young, this was an unwanted child, and she did not rejoice in his outstanding behavior. But Se-gyong, finally seeing this much-awaited son, was astonished and amused. The boy was growing up so fast that Se-gyong often measured his height, asking, "When did you grow so?" Every day Se-gyong played with the boy, feeling that in some mysterious way it was his own body, which just became divided into two. When Se-gyong looked at the amusing things the boy did, his face shone, and embracing Pong-hee, Se-gyong said, "Now my boy is encouraging me to study, but then he is distracting me, so why don't I make him read instead?" With these words, Se-gyong taught Pong-hee the 6 characters for heaven, earth, man, son, father, and mother. Pong-hee took the book right away and found these characters one by one, and then I will skip to the second paragraph. Then Se-gyong raised his eyes. Hyun-young's expression was cold like a crisp plum blossom. Her hands arranged orderly and her gaze lowered, she was not even looking at the tender amusements of father and son. Finding Hyun-young so cold-hearted, Se-gyong said to her, "To me, the relationship of father and son is the most precious thing in the world. I have a father above me and the son below me, myself being in between. At the moment, my heart is filled with joy. Is it not the same for you?" After pondering it silently, Hyun-young said, "Is there anyone unable to appreciate the feelings shared between parents and children? For someone like me, cut off from my own natural essence from above, what can I know of the natural affection that continues below? In the same way, all people have children and raise them, but becoming unworthy of one's parents and thoughtlessly forgetting the boundless grace given by the parents, only caring for one's own progeny, is the way of birds and beasts. Although people are unsteady, they are different from birds and beasts, and seeing a young child fills their hearts with tremor. How can love and affection be altered?" And Hyun-young's attitude becomes all the more poignant after we see this very tactile, intimate playing between the father and the son. In the end, of course, they all reconcile because the Lineage novels need to have their happy end. But it's curious that at this moment, the husband who is caught in conflict with his father-in-law actually loses authority over his wife. She clearly disobeys. She demands that the conflict between the son-in-law and the father-in-law be reconciled. And she becomes an unloving mother, a very striking, unusual image for Joseon fiction. The two men reconcile, but this seems to be a distasteful, though necessary compromise that enables the woman to balance her affective connection with her father, right, which is seen as dangerous and disruptive to her husband's patriarchal authority. So what do lineage novels do with these narratives of emotion? I would like to say that they diagnose the hot and cold spots of kinship, situations of emotional lack or excess. Women's position within kinship becomes subject to intense scrutiny, and yet women's position is understood exclusively through their relationship with men. We, for example, do not have such nuanced accounts of daughters and mothers' relationship. And women are seen as dangerous. They can be frigid mothers, but sometimes they can also be excessively chaste. They can deny bed to their husbands. And when the marriage is not consumed, certainly they would have a hard time getting new generations of the lineage descendants. So stopping here with the first frame in which I consider the lineage novel, its relationship to Korean kinship, I would like to propose a second frame and think about the place of the lineage novel in the 17th century, which is actually seen as the global age of the novel. So in her new, relatively new book, I think it's been a few years, in her visionary study titled The Age of Silver, Rise of the Novel East and West, Ning Ma considers cases of fictional prose from China, Japan, England, and Spain. And what she does is she historicizes and disenchants central categories that structure the study of the Western novel, such as deep interiority, dialogical imagination, heteroglossia, and transcendental homelessness. To dismantle the grand narrative of the rise of the Western novel, Ma points at a shared horizontal connection. The flows of silver from the Spanish colonies in South America to Europe and then Asia. The money flows produce the effect of unmooring of the normative social structure, which is mirrored in the literary space, where individuated life narratives adjust the lens of the literary form from epic to the biographical. Korea's position within the global silver infrastructure is curious. Even though Korea was the essential conduit of Japanese silver into China in the late 17th century when the lineage novels appear, this circulation of silver was limited to diplomatic trade rather than internal use within the country, and the scope of Korean economy's monetization remained limited. The narratives of unruly, antisocial emotions that lineage novels depict can be more readily linked to the cultural influence rather than the change of social structure. Their marginalia allows us to connect the manuscripts of the remarkable reunion of Jade Mandarin ducks, that was the second manuscript that I showed, to a kin group with a peculiar intellectual bent, the Tokchon branch of the Jeonju-yi, known for their interest in Wang Yangming scholarship. Wang Yangming's notions of personal authenticity and private insight have been understood by scholars as responses to the commercialized society of the late Ming China, in which material abundance and commercial circulation of things, which were now unmoored from their proper location, undermined the certainty of objective knowledge. Wang Yangming's philosophy is seen in turn as a major influence on the so-called cult of Qing, or cult of emotion, that swept across cultural production in late imperial China, bringing narratives of the eccentric and the strange, and the primacy of feelings, especially desire, to the center stage of cultural production. While Wang Yangming's scholarship was frowned upon by the Joseon state, engagement with his writings took form of private family learning, for which the Tokchon branch of the Jeonju-yi is known. In addition, lineage novels evince the influence of the so-called scholar beauty novel, also part of the Chinese cult of Qing. Scholar beauty novels rearticulate the normative marital bond as subject to mutual attraction and choice, depicting lovers who share comparable sensibilities and refinement. One lineage novel, The Record of Sohyun Song, in fact even uses that phrase, Caizijaren or Cheja scholar and the beauty, in the text. So these broad brushstrokes, again, everything about the lineage novel can only be done in broad brushstrokes, allow us to link the depiction of unruly feelings in the lineage novel to the cult of Qing, but the connection is not that of coeval social change, but that of literary influence. And of course, the important peculiarity of the Korean case is that lineage novels inscribe the spectacular depictions of unruly feelings into genealogical horizon and the concern about the continuity of the lineage. And now to end, I want to turn to my postscript, right, and actually think about what happened to the lineage novels in the early 20th century. So at the turn of the 20th century, lineage novels began circulating through rental libraries. The economic empowerment of secondary status groups produces thirst for elite culture, and lineage novels by the time become understood as its quintessence. The manuscript you see on your screen is called The Record of Two Households, Ha and Jin, Hajin Youngmunrok, and it seems to be a rental library manuscript produced around 1908. What is interesting about this text is, I wonder if you can see a faint margin note that runs at the bottom margin, penciled in there. This margin note begins in volume 2 and runs through the entire third volume. And this margin note actually references the text written by Phan Boi Chau. I mispronounced that name profoundly, probably, I apologize. Titled History of the Loss of Vietnam. History of the Loss of Vietnam describes the French occupation of the country in the 19th century. It was published in Shanghai in 1905 with a preface by the famed Chinese intellectual Liang Qichao. And this text reached Korea in 1906. It was first serialized in Hwangsong Shinmun, or Imperial Gazette, and underwent 3 translations and several reprints, reaching a wide audience until it was censored in 1909. And this is the content of the margin note. The note reads, "Library owner, son of a bitch, can you read? Do you know what this age is like? It is the 20th century, where strong prey on the weak and where the fittest survive. You too live in this world. Don't you know anything about the 20th century? Living in this terrifying world, people applying their abilities to any occupation, agriculture, commerce, manufacturing, on the verge of collapse. The power is in the hands of the strong. How is it that you neglect agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing, and instead take up this useless book-lending trade to make a living? This is all to your own detriment. But because you too are a person of Korea, this is the country's misfortune as well. Now, what is the state of affairs in our country? Have you not heard about the history of the loss of Vietnam? It is the same in our country, where people abandoned practical occupations, entertaining fanciful beliefs. Now they are ready to continue the destiny of Vietnam and Poland. Even those men whose fervor had been extinguished, if they put their thoughts to this situation, they would cry days on end, abandoning food and drink, and even then would fail to obtain relief. What about you? Do you still live in the dream world of the peach garden, expecting to enjoy everlasting prosperity? The rise and fall of states very much depend on whether their customs are sound or awry. So the lineage novel here, the text in question, provides some kind of confluence of the old media and new questions. During their prime, the margins of the lineage novels organized the space for the expression of familial sentiments as generations of readers encountered the brushstrokes of the now deceased female kin. In the early 20th century, these margins provide a space for the rumination of the country's critical position within the contemporary geopolitical layout. According to this reader, the lineage novel is closer to the fanciful tales that delude those who live in a world that operates according to the logic of social Darwinism. In the early 20th century, narratives of kinship life that uphold the lineage structure no longer seem relevant to those who live in the world that is being carved up by the global spread of imperialism. So after this moment, shortly after, some lineage novels circulate until the 1930s, but ultimately they fade from cultural memory, as I already mentioned, and only re-emerge very recently as a suggestive archive that sheds a different light on the history of early modern Korea that is focused on women culture and the cultural logic of emotion. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion during the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Ksenia. That was fascinating book talk presentation. So I think this is really a great addition to the field, especially in pre-modern Korean literature. I mean, for our first talk, we had invited Professor Sinead Park at Harvard, and she had talked about her book, which was about Yadam, the vernacular story. And I think your book really adds to the field by talking about lineage, introducing lineage novels to the English in English speaking world, so which wasn't really talked much about in the past. So I think really this is a great addition. So I would like to use my prerogative as a moderator to ask my questions. I mean, I just have so many questions, but I would like to ask three, and then I'll attend questions from our audiences. So first is about your usage of emotions and affect. So, I was really, I mean, it's really interesting how you discussed about human bonds and this unruly emotions in the context of kinship novels. And because this is really about, the familial relationships and all sorts of emotions are, are discussed in this novel. Excuse me. And so, but I'm interested in, because in the field of emotions and theory and affect theory, I mean, scholars tend to distinguish between those two. And so in your reading of these lineage novels, I'm wondering, how you would distinguish emotions and affect when reading these sources. And then second is about, you talk about early Korean modernity, and it's really interesting to see how you place Korean lineage novels within the context of more, global context of novels in the 17th century. And this again too, like when we talk about early modern, there's still some scholars who, question whether we can use this, periodization in Chosån Korea. So I would, I personally think that we can, but I think, I would like to ask you to explain your take on the usage of early modern in the Chosån context. And then finally, oh, this, I'm just so interested in all these, different types of emotions, which I think you, you put them as unruly emotions that are manifested in these lineage novels. But I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little more about this unruly feelings or emotions. What are they exactly, right? And what kind of emotions? I mean, you didn't really mention or get into details in your presentation, but you do talk about feelings of flesh and blood, 골육지정, in your book. And I know, Sunju Kim, Professor Sunju Kim had published an excellent article on this. But because I think this is really I think, that in some ways very distinct in the Chosun context, especially this, the issue of the secondary sons and the relationship between the parents and the concubines' children is very distinctive, especially within the East Asian context. So as I'm referring to Soja and Arja, and in practice. In petitions, we see so many tensions between legitimate wife and concubine's son. But in this novel, you talk about the tension between father-in-law and son-in-law, which I think is something that is really imagined in the fictional space. So I really see that find this very fascinating. So, but in lineage novels, I'm sure there are a lot of tensions talked about between, because there's you talk about. I've written an article about from jealousy to violence, which really discusses about the tension between legitimate wife and concubines, and the kind of role played by the husband here. And if you look at, I mean, this legitimate wife is always, seen as this jealous wife, right? And which is thought to be evil, and also actually punished for being jealous. So I, and how do you, and in your description of this unruly emotions, so how do you see this kind of, tension? You talked about father-in-law and a son-in-law tension, but I also want to hear your understanding or reading of this tension between wife and concubine or concubine's son in the novel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Choso, for all of these questions. Of course, you are the historian of emotions in Chosŏn, and I could expect that much. So I guess to the first question, the distinction between emotion and affect, right? I mean, the conventional distinction is that affect is something precognitive. It's some kind of an intensity that doesn't achieve a complete legible form. So I actually don't get into the theoretical distinction. I stop myself at saying that I will use emotion, sentiments, and affective as an adjective interchangeably. And for me, basically, emotions constitute a form of habitus, right? We could turn to Raymond Williams, structures of feelings, some kinds of volatile orientations that guide action in a particular time that are not kind of coalescing into institutions. Then, of course, the European historian Barbara Rosenwein also talked about this kind of mode of approaching emotions as habitus, as something that is legible and as something that actually constitutes some kind of a grammar of the period, of the historical period. Of course, for me, I read this text from the Lineage Novels, so it's almost like running a keyword search through this text to see what feelings resurface and in what context. So for me, what's crucial is not the theory of emotions, but legibility, what descript feelings are visible and in what circumstances do they transpire. The question about early modernity is, of course, very interesting, very contested. I was also very kind of unsure if I want to use this designation, because yes, it could be a limiting umbrella terms that sets up some kind of a unifying standard for what it means to be early modern. But then I really loved Nyingma's approach, in which she kind of maps this rise of a certain cultural outlook across the world. Chosŏn, of course, doesn't, as I said, participate in it immediately, right? So there is kind of lateral connection through cultural influence, but I really like the term early modern in that it allows us to establish broader framework of connections across the world. So this is how I use it, but if I was forced to theorize what Korea's early modern is, I would be really at a loss, and I can only speak about my own texts and my own studies. But thank you for that question, it's very important. Then you asked about kind of what are unruly emotions, where do they stand, and where do they fit about kind of within the broader aesthetic conception of the lineage novel. I have a whole chapter of it, and I wonder now if I will be able to reconstruct it. But basically, in the lineage novel, I distinguish three types of emotions. These are human feelings, feelings of flesh and blood, as you said. This phrase is used by Professor Sunjo Kim in her studies, and then unruly emotions. So the human feelings, they kind of constitute the ideal of ethically moderated sentiments. Is what you feel is completely appropriate to your station. Feelings of flesh and blood, as the title suggests, are these particularly intense feelings that are shared between blood-related parents and children, and also siblings. And blood feelings are actually interesting because on the one hand, they do come into alignment with human sentiments because you are supposed to feel affection for your children, for example. But there are situations when the intensity of blood feelings actually overrides the moral prescription. For example, when a vengeful stepmother tries to kill a stepson because she loves her own son so much and she wants him to be the lineage heir. Here we have a problem. And unruly feelings are not feelings of blood. They're not based on blood. They're any kind of eruptions, violent, unruly behaviors that are actually signifying that the person who is feeling these feelings and who is acting upon them feels that he or she is out of joint with his or her prescribed position within the kinship. So blood feelings are interesting. They can either be unruly or they can actually be okay, and they could align with the human sentiments. And then a really very interesting question about the concubines, children and primary wives. And I also learned a lot from your study, Emotion of Justice, where you talk about the lawsuits that the primary wives would have against concubines' children, because I also look at the funerary texts that elite men write for their secondary children, where they express love. And Martin Deucher tells us that they would often even bequeath property to these people, right? So it was a very interesting and enlightening tension that I also learned from your book. But it's very interesting how the concubines and wives, they do have some conflicts in the lineage novel, but it's actually only the concubine who can be evil, right? So the primary wife she always has to be good, because she is the appropriate wife for that household, right? So there are conflicts, but right, appropriate, right? So she's always the one who suffers, never retaliates, never does anything to that nasty concubine who tries to kill her oftentimes. And what is very interesting about the concubine's children, I find that they are actually somehow shown as inheriting the heredity of the patriline. What that means is oftentimes concubines can be just really gaudy, uncouth, crude, those kinds of women that don't really fit the bar of the elite womanhood, but their children would actually be okay. Most often than not, they would actually inherit their father's quality, and they would be this wonderfully refined ladies and gentlemen. So I guess here there's some kind of a fanciful repackaging of the actual layout that was probably what you see in the legal case.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this is, what makes fictional space so interesting, because in practice is the legitimate wife who's the evil, really, because she's the one who's committing all this violence against the concubine who she hates so much and so jealous of, right? And even commits murder and kill them. But in the novels, they're depicted as virtuous, and the evil is the concubine. But anyways, okay. Thank you. Well, we see so many questions, so I think we'll get into the questions from our attendees. So I would like to begin this question by Professor Joseph E. What is the influence of early kinship novels on the formation of early modern Korean literature in early 20th century? I think you kind of alluded this in your final conclusion, but I think if you could elaborate on that. And then I would also like to ask a question by Sue Kim, like what's so special about kinship in Korea? Because she says kinship is universal. So what is it that made you get interested in kinship as main theme of your research?
Right. Thank you so much for this question. So, to Professor Yee's question about the influence of kinship novels on the early modern Korean literature, I actually don't know about that. The reason is as we know, the early modern Korean writers, such as Lee Kwang-soo, they were actually not from elite families. And lineage novels would be the prerogative of the elites. As I said later, they do have some limited circulation through the rental libraries. Some people are reading them outside of the tight kinship circles in which they will want to circulate. But then in the early 20th century, we can hardly say that lineage novels really reached far and wide. It probably was in Seoul, right, limited audience who are interested in precisely this type of narrative. So actually, I'm also quite interested to see who else was reading these texts, but hardly I can speak about the immediate verifiable historical link between the lineage novel and actually the early modern, the first modern texts in Korea. And a question by Sue Kim, thank you for that as well. So actually why I was interested in these texts, honestly, when I saw all of these women trying to kill each other, I was a little bit surprised, because the violence reaches such an amazing degree. And then you need to keep in mind that these would be very elite texts. So very elite women would be reading them. And this cognitive dissonance actually made me dig deeper, trying to understand what this text actually meant. And again, what is special about Korean kinship, I guess, setting it apart from the universal practice, I think Professor Jisoo Kim just kind of mentioned that in the Korean case, the blood ties would just remain, the ties with the women's natal families, right? This final ties remain so strong throughout, producing lots of legal conflicts, as Professor Kim shows in her writing, and also producing this intense narrative desire. It's interesting that these novels, to me, they're written specifically with the goal of trying to understand what kinship is, how to do kinship, and also almost offering some kind of a consolation for those who are suffering in the process of doing it. And I must say, lineage novels are actually a massive phenomenon. We know dozens of titles. and thousands of volumes of this text exist. So it's actually a sweeping cultural momentum centered on elite women and very, very unruly, which leads me to believe that this elite culture of Chosŏn actually allowed some level of some kind of non-conformity and licentiousness, even to not licentiousness in the sexual sense, but some kind of easygoing attitude to the elite women who participate in this culture.
Right. Thank you. I think related to this, I think, there's also another question related to the decline of kinship novels. So by Maria Bez, does the arrival of Westerners in Korea in the early 20th century have anything to do with the decline of kinship novels?
Well, I would say that the arrival of Westerners kind of undermines this trust in this view of the world where you cultivate moral bonds at home and take them out to the larger world by becoming a loyal kind of subject to your sovereign, right? Because lineage novels are actually written in this they provide this kind of matrix of understanding the world. You order your household and then you go out and serve the country. And what is interesting in the lineage novels, all of these lineage members, they then are very much the high-ranking officials at court. They're the generals who go out to fight the battles on behalf of the emperor. Right? So this is this moral, very Confucian idea of the world. So of course, the arrival of Westerners, the colonial politics, undermines the trust that this actually works, right? And the quote that I read in the postscript, it really tells us, can we please stop reading these texts? Because we are looking at social Darwinism that doesn't seem to operate according to this logic. So indirectly, this is just the changes in the world with which lineage novels were no longer compatible.
All right, thanks. Next, we have a question by Emmanuel Kim. How are lineage novels stories different from Yadam? Were lineage novels ever read for escapist purposes? In other words, for entertainment rather than the moral learning?
Right, thank you, Manuel, for this question. So this is something that, of course, we can twist either way, right? So on the one hand, lineage novels are very moralistic because everyone settles in the end, the lineage survives. This is all kind of very moralizing. But then on the other hand, we do see that they give just so much space to the elaboration of unruly emotions that I wouldn't be able to. I mean, I can imagine that the women who are reading it would very easily kind of identify with what is happening in the narrative, albeit we have no written note that would prove that. Because again, I think the margins of a novel are not a private space. It's a family book. And you can't just say, oh, this poor lady who is suffering at the hands of her husband, how I identify with her, right? That would be a little bit inappropriate. But in terms of kind of escapism or perhaps solace, there is one interesting text that's actually the sequel to the remarkable reunion of Jade Mandarin Ducks. And at the end of it, there is a character. She is locked in conflict with her husband. She dies, travels to the underworld, and she's particularly good at adjudicating the cases for the souls of the dead. So she gets a reward. She's told, now you're going to be born as a man. And then she fades back into her human body, which is that of a woman, and she kind of looks in surprise, oh, the promise was broken. And then she faintly hears the voice that says, well, even the subjects owe their loyalty to the sovereign. So, this gender hierarchies, they're actually relative within the broader framework of social hierarchies. So there's a moment, if not escapism, but some kind of an elaboration of these conflicted feelings.
Thanks. I think we have many interesting questions here. So by Miguel Rivera Santos, could you expand a little more on the handwritten notes added by the elite women readers to the manuscripts? You mentioned that some notes discuss the value of the book and the necessity to preserve it for future generations, but did some comments also engage with the content of the book or commented on the quality of the copy, calligraphy, as the elderly lady you mentioned seemed to do when she complained about the legibility of the manuscript she was copying? I'm particularly interested in the interaction between the readers and the book itself.
Thank you so much for this question. I mean, I'm really quite possessed somehow by my interest in the vernacular calligraphy because I have encountered it in this very alive form of this familial palimpsest of the lineage novel manuscript. So how did they interact, the readers and the book? It's interesting how the readers would almost read this text to death. They would be worn out, patched, and then a note would say, and on this day in this year it was patched, and then the covers were changed, right? So it's an intensely alive object. In terms of the margin notes, so yes, mostly the quality of the calligraphy, mostly it's good, right? So they would say pearl-like letters of the mothers and aunts, kweju. Then as the one, I of course did not look at all of the manuscripts of all Lineage novels. I worked with 6 texts, and among them this manuscript transcribed by the elderly lady, it was kind of an outlier. It was interesting that she actually said, oh, this is really bad handwriting. So for me, that's one I know, but it tells us that that also existed. The injunction that the text be preserved, it's almost everywhere. And this is actually not only in Lineage novels. A lot of different texts would have somehow that prescription. Let's preserve this manuscript for posterity. And this could be linked also to the kind of filial significance of manuscript, because someone has written them out. And this is a bodily trace of probably your kin's person. And then unfortunately for me, I guess, I was hoping that they would write something interesting in the margins, something even subversive, but no, as I said, margins are public normative space. And all they would say is, oh, the beautiful conduct of these families members, right? So it would always be something that doesn't go against some kind of the social norm that is prevalent at the time.
Just a follow-up question. Last time, Huisang, in Huisang's book talk, as you know, Huisang has really shown this, the writing style in the epistles, and I'm just wondering, in this calligraphy that you've encountered, is there any similar kind of like circular writing that you've noticed, or is it just straight line throughout?
That is actually interesting. So I would say, as a literary text, right, it's kind of written just like this, and the margin notes are usually appended on the kind of, if there's a space, it's not so much a margin. The last margin note I showed, it really ran through the margin, but the other notes, they would kind of be appended at the end of the chapter. So there, I actually haven't seen the circular way that Huisang describes, but again, I haven't seen all of the manuscripts. But I would also have a hunch that privately produced novels, they don't leave so much margin space, right? Because the paper is expensive. So all of the writings would be really kind of squeezed to that left-hand side from what I have seen. But that's a very interesting question.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a question from Elena. Elena Kondratyeva, sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong. Thank you very much for your presentation. Could you please tell a few words about the language of the novels, grammar and vocabulary? Was it standardized language? Can we notice any dialectical or special features in the novel language?
Thank you for that question, Elena. And unfortunately, I'm not really an expert and linguist, right? I have a sense that there are some dialectical variations. I won't be able, kind of off the top of my head, to back it up, but there are some kinds of variations of spelling. And in terms of standardized, how should I say? I don't think we can talk about standardization at this point, right? The same vocabulary could be transcribed in a variety of ways within the same text, right? So actually, the way I learned to read this text is kind of you figure it out for each particular novel, because each particular scriber would not only do the kind of the linguistics elements in her or his own way, but also the calligraphy is very idiosyncratic. There are actually randomly some texts that don't write out the Korean real at the end. They just do this, and it looks like an N. And you kind of go figure at the beginning what they're trying to say. So there is a lot of variation. And my hunch, which I can't speak to more, unfortunately, is that there might be some regional variation in the dialect.
Thank you. Next question by Yuna Kim. Were there any interventions of the Choson dynasty as a state in regulating the publication and the distribution of lineage novels? Also, do you see in the novels any attempts and efforts that highlighted fidelity to the state?
Oh, that is very interesting. So fidelity to the state is unquestionable, right? This is just absolutely not, you cannot think about it otherwise than being a loyal minister. for the lineage members. They're often embroiled in some kinds of court intrigues, but they're always the righteous ones. They would go into exile, preserve their loyalty, and come back. So in that sense, actually, these texts are extremely orthodox. And that maybe will allow us to answer your first question, right? Did state interfere? Well, the highest loyalty, the highest virtue is preserved, right? So nothing to worry about. And also for the state, was it Professor Baker who wrote the Private Orthodoxy and Orthopraxy? Or was it Professor Walraven? It's in that volume.
You mean I think it was Professor Baker, Don Baker.
Okay, about the kind of, right, orthodoxy and orthopraxy. So as long as you don't go out and try to convince people to do something that goes against the foundations of the state actually tolerated it, right? And lineage novels are very private texts. So, it's kind of, they circulate through kinship connections. They ultimately say lineage is good, state is good, be loyal, be virtuous, and you will get to terms with all of your unruly feelings by the end. So in the end, this kind of orthodox layout, the macro structure, perhaps in fact enabled those unruly emotions that always in the end, like, no, it all worked out. And here are the 3 new generations that lived afterwards. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have a question by Professor Namlin Ho. In lineage novels, women's emotions, feelings were freely expressed, not suppressed in Confucian terms, but inscribed, galvanized in genealogical terms. You suggest this new phenomenon had to do with cultural influence from China. Wang Yangming, would you like to elaborate more on the cultural influence from China in the 17th century? What cultural influence, more specifically?
What I mean by cultural influence is, again, very explicit, that the Chinese books, such as Wang Yangming's scholarship, is circulating in Korea, and that scholar beauty novels, also part of the cult of Qing, are also circulating in Korea. But in terms of what else allows us to actually link the lineage novel to these sorts of cultural developments in China, it's very interesting that in the lineage novel too, I actually think that this is also scholar beauty novel influence. The husband and the wife are also often shown in this scholar beauty terms. They're both extremely beautiful. You have seen how the boy was being hit on by his father-in-law. They are very refined. The women are usually able to write poetry and calligraphy. Sometimes the men would see the calligraphy of this wife with whom they're in conflict, and he would be so moved. So they share this aesthetic sensibilities. So there's this sort of, I think the China scholars called it some kind of gender neutralizing logic, where actually the husbands and wife share something in common, rather than the notion of separation of genders, right? Women inside, men outside. This, however, ends with marriage. Marriages are very violent. Rapes happens, beatings up happen. This is all very peculiar to the lineage novel. But otherwise, I would say that, again, in very broad brushstrokes, we could establish those links through that manuscript of the remarkable reunion of Jade Mandarin ducks, through the fact that the phrase beauty and the scholar is referenced by the lineage novels, and through the narrative analysis that really shows this slight gender bending logic in the description of the couples. So that's where I can talk about this.
Okay, thanks. I think we have a similar question that Emmanuel asked, but I think a little different. Could you comment by Shalom Park? Could you comment more on how the genre of lineage novel was distinct from other forms of vernacular novel or vernacular poetry in terms of how feelings are expressed differently?
Thank you, Shalom, for your questions. So I think in the lineage novel, compared to the, say, shorter fiction, these texts express emotions without providing immediately a moralistic reading. So, for example, someone is misbehaving, someone does something terrible, and that person always has the right to explain. And these protagonists, they just talk a lot. They could talk for 2 pages, and they could say, why I did this, this and that happened. I was actually suffering from these particular circumstances. And actually, when you read the text, these were objectively conditioning circumstances. So kind of this multi-perspectival description of emotions that actually authenticates feelings as integral private experiences. This is very much what lineage novel is about. And it's interesting how there is Yoon Taek-young, so she's a scion of the royal family, and she was actually in touch with the scholars of kind of court culture, vernacular literature in the 20th century. She died in 1980s, so she told them a lot. And she actually wrote in one article, in an interview in 1960s, she said, oh, you couldn't imagine reading shorter texts, they're just so boring. So the lineage novel, this sophisticated portrayal, she doesn't say you couldn't read short text because lineage novels talk about emotions. She just said it's just so boring. And I think we could interpret it as kind of this very sophisticated, multivalent representation of conflicting feelings.
Thank you. We have a question from Yu Lu. Do authors also write about the world of men, that is, work, lives, problems of husbands and sons, political or economic intrigues they're involved in, etc.? And do women in the novels provide their insights on these matters?
Oh, this is such a wonderful question. Thank you. So yes, definitely. And I hope in my presentation, maybe I did that actually, and I should take the blame, but in the book, I do try to actually say that it's not that women stand as these embodiments of emotion, that they're irrational, just emotional, and don't know how to handle things. Men suffer too. They suffer because they cannot control their wives and everyone is laughing at them, or they suffer because they're just so tired of their wives just wreaking havoc upon their households. So the plight of the patriarch is very much depicted in some of the texts. Yes, they do get into trouble with the kind of outside world at court, they go into exile. An interesting question about the economic part of the business. Most of the lineage novels are actually, well, again, I read 6, so within that group, let's say, 5 texts would be about affluent households. Somehow it's very natural that an established household will also have wealth. But one novel, again, this remarkable reunion of Jade Mandarin Ducks, it actually looks into the life of a poor scholar who lives in the countryside and who simply has to go gather his own firewood to provide. And his wife, rather than offering counsel, I would say that the answer is no. They don't explicitly offer counsel on the official business, but she is also very capable of doing her own share of the household work, and she also sells some of her embroideries. So she indirectly helps with the kind of running the household, but no, women don't have the voice about external affairs.
Okay, thank you. Next question by Yumi Kim. Her question is, there are several terms, lineage novel, kin novel, and clan fiction, indicating works from the 17th century, 소연 성록 to the 20th century. How can we distinguish those terms?
That is also a great question. Thank you very much. In the Korean scholarship, these texts are called kamun sosol, lineage novels. They are also called teha sosol, or romance de fleuve, that actually kind of remark on the length. There's also a term taejangpyeon, kamun sosol, long kinship novels. But basically, why I chose the term lineage novel is actually, for me, this term includes the comment on the length, because lineage novels cover several generations, and by necessity, these texts have to be very long, right? So, and actually, I mean, I found that, all of these terms, including sometimes kibongdu sosol, although they're a little bit more specific because different non-lineage novels can also be classified as novels of encounter that lead to marriage. But most of them are actually kind of all referring to lineage novels most of the time. So this is where I stop. I decided the main problematic in this text is kinship, patrilineal kinship, lineage, and that term also allows us to think about familial transmission of the text, again, through generations of the lineage, and also it allows us to think about the length, multi-generational narratives.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question by Ji-hoon Chun from University of Bochum. How widespread were novels written in vernacular Korean characters since the 17th century? There was a letter found written by the mother of King Cheongjo. Were there any novels by elite women like those of royal clan?
How widespread were novels written in vernacular? I guess pretty widespread, right? I mean, even if you just consider lineage novels, just how many of them are written, it really did become a very sizable literary tradition. In terms of authorship, it's very interesting. As I said, we don't have a single female author. There is one that's kind of suggested for one of the novels, but we cannot really say for any of the novel with any confidence whatsoever who could have been the author. And actually, scholars believe that it would be more probably appropriate to think about communal authorship. Because for some of the lineage novels, there are actually external notes that show that these particular manuscripts were made by men and women together in the family circle as their pastime. So we could maybe imagine that some of the texts would also similarly be composed by these joint efforts of family members, perhaps of both genders.
Okay, thank you. Next question by Sunyoung Lee. It is surprising to see how women in the novels are resistant to the social norms imposed on them. It seems that these women are described as driven by unruly feelings, which will eventually lead to reconciliations. Would you elaborate more on the remedies used to appease those unruly feelings in the lineage novels, if those feelings were ever ruled?
All right, how do you deal with these people, right? That's a great question, Son. Thank you. I think actually one of the ways, the only Confucian way to appease is actually to kind of exert your benevolent influence, right? So sometimes that's one of the ways. So when there's this really evil stepmother who tries to kill her stepson, and he's just so virtuous, he's so patient, that in the end, when she converts, she kind of thinks about him very highly, right? He did that. For other cases, some of the lineage novels actually end very abruptly. There's a conflict, they were about to kill each other, and then 3 generations are born, right? So there's some kind of full stop placed to that. And sometimes it could be just a blatant coercion. So in the other novel, Hyunshi Yangun Sangningi, The Record of Two Heroes, Brothers Hyun, when there is this protracted conflict between the husband and his wife, in the end, the father, the patriarch of the family, calls her up and says, "You know enough. You had your point, you had your reasons, and now you're married. That's it." And then they kind of settle. So there are actually different ways of dealing with this, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Professor James Lewis. He's asking to comment on adoption. I think it'd be interesting if you could also talk about, this tension with that comes with this adoption, because in reality, again, talking about petitions, we do see many disputes, legal disputes, that's related to adoption. So for example, like this legitimate wife is trying to give more property to this adopted son, who is the legitimate heir, right? So in the absence of sons, there was this practice of adoption in Chosån Korea, and but then there's this concubine's son who's trying to, like trying to prevent that and trying to get more property for himself. And so there's that there's a lot, and then the mother-in-law, who is the legitimate wife, right, is basically trying to really accuse this the concubine's son for being such a bad son, and trying to illegally like deprive the property of the legitimate son. So there's all sorts of inheritance dispute going on in the late Chosun. And so I'm wondering, this lineage novel related to that adoption, what kind of interesting stories do you see?
Yeah, that's also such a great question. So, what seems to come out of the lineage novel is that there was a great deal of anxiety about adoption. So, in one and the same novel, The Pledge at the Banquet of Moon Gazing Pavilion, One Walhaminyan, there are actually 2 scenes of adoption. And the first one takes place when basically 2 families exchange sons. The fathers are linked by their brothers, and then one son goes to one family, the other one goes to another. And in the first case of adoption, when the son is being adopted, the future father, the one who adopts him, he actually writes a note on the boy's hand. And he writes it in the so called nightingale blood that was supposed to testify virginity in women. And here on the boy's body, he writes this inscription because it's durable. It's not going to be washed off until the boy loses his virginity. It's not emasculating in his case. There's no intimation as such. And he writes, on this day, he was adopted by me and I gave him this name. So there's some kind of desire to secure that boy for himself. In the very same novel, the second adoption instance takes place, right? So the childless couple adopts a boy, then the wife dies, the husband remarries, and this evil stepmother, who will be in the future, she has her own children. And she hates the adopted son so much, she just wants to kill him to clear the space for her own child to inherit the property. So it's clear that somehow it's very difficult for her to reconcile her love that she has for her own children with the fact that she just needs to accept this heir. And this boy who is being harassed in all ways by his stepmother, what is interesting, so he's adopted out of his family and he continues to have a very strong connection with his birth mother. So actually, before he goes out for a long kind of military expedition, he goes to visit his mother and they share a bed, not in an incestuous way, but it's a moment of intimacy where they bid farewell to each other. So I was actually surprised even by this depiction of the lingering affective connections between the children who adopted out and their actual biological parents.
Right, thank you. I think we are almost out of time now, but I would like to end this event, book talk, by asking this one final question. So what does kinship mean for you?
That is such a great question. So I think for me, kinship means some kind of a social norm, a normative configuration of social practices in that society of the time. And then for me, then I guess it represents some kind of a background that calls forth this narrative, imaginative elaborations of the social life that kind of reconfigure a little bit of what is happening on the ground, but also lead us to think about, what Raymond Williams called the structures of feeling, some kinds of effects that circulate within the social space without achieving kind of an ossified, formalized form. So it's the social practice, I guess, and the narrative desire that it produces. But thank you. That's a great question.
Well, thank you so much. And, it's been really wonderful to have you in our book talk series. And thank you so much for our attendees for submitting such a great question. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation and to the audience. I had so much fun. Thank you.